December 16th, 1944. Early morning, Mona, Germany. The frozen ground shook as another round of American artillery thundered overhead. But this morning was different. Shockingly, terrifyingly different. The shells weren't slamming into the dirt or splintering trees. Instead, they exploded in midair, right above the advancing German troops, raining down deadly steel fragments that no trench or foxhole could shield them from. Among the 326th Volksgrenadier Division attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadron, even battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front were stunned. This wasn't the artillery they knew. No predictable impacts. No safe zones. No protection in the earth. This was death from above, calculated with chilling accuracy. At that moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had made one of the boldest unauthorized calls of the entire Battle of the Bulge. Against orders, without waiting for approval, he told his gunners to load the Allies' most closely guarded secret, proximity fuses. Inside each shell was a tiny radar device that sensed how close it was to its target and exploded at the perfect height. The effect multiplied the killing power of artillery by 50. In the frozen Ardennes forest, the very math of destruction had been rewritten. The German soldiers had no idea they were facing a weapon so revolutionary it would change not just this battle, but the future of warfare itself. The storm had broken. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun with high hopes for the Wehrmacht that Hitler's last gamble brought 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery guns, all hidden in the fog-draped Ardennes. The Führer promised his generals that this surprise attack would split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and turn back a war that was clearly sliding toward defeat. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the offensive began with complete surprise. German artillery roared to life, firing 1,600 shells every minute across an 85-mile front. American intelligence had failed completely. They never saw the buildup coming. Many of the frontline U.S. units were either fresh recruits with no battle experience or exhausted veterans sent to this quiet sector for rest. At Monshaw, Colonel Axelson faced the impossible. His 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being crushed by overwhelming German numbers. Regular artillery couldn't stop the assault. Out of desperation, Axelson made a decision that would change the battle. He ordered his gunners to use the Allies' most secret weapon, proximity-fused shells. He had no authorization, and he risked court-martial later, but he knew obeying orders meant certain defeat. The results were instant and devastating. German troops, advancing in their usual assault formations, suddenly faced a kind of firepower they had never imagined. The shells didn't hit the ground. They exploded 30 to 50 feet above them, raining steel fragments in wide, deadly cones. Soldiers who thought they were safe, hidden in foxholes, crouched behind trees, or lying in ditches, were torn apart. This was the secret science of death. The proximity fuse. The proximity fuse represented the peak of American science and industry working together at full power. Unlike normal shells that only exploded on direct impact, or time-fused ones that often went off at the wrong height, this fuse carried its own tiny radar system, no bigger than a coffee can. Inside each fuse, American engineers managed to fit 130 electronic parts, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes, depending on the model. These tubes weren't fragile anymore. They were redesigned to survive the brutal 20,000 gs of force when fired from a cannon. The physics were mind-blowing. The moment the shell was fired, the crushing acceleration broke a tiny glass ampoule inside, releasing fluid to activate a battery. That battery powered the radar for the entire flight of the shell. Driving this breakthrough was Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. He pushed the project with the same intensity as the Manhattan Project. The lab itself was disguised as an abandoned car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, and at its peak, it secretly employed 3% of all American physicists. Security was so tight that even workers couldn't tell their families what they were building. Every single fuse carried its own serial number to be tracked like gold. The challenge seemed impossible at first. Radio tubes designed for living room radios had to be completely reimagined to survive the shock of artillery fire. They had to keep working while spinning thousands of times per second, in rain, snow, mud, and freezing cold, and still be sensitive enough to explode near a target, but not too early. The breakthrough came through miniaturization, a step that would later fuel the electronics revolution. Dr. James Van Allen created vacuum tubes no bigger than pencil erasers, but with all the power of full-sized radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Over 100 companies took part in the project, from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crosley Corporation. The program cost reached $1 billion in 1940s dollars, making it second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime spending. But Axelson's unauthorized decision on December 16th created an immediate command crisis. He had broken strict orders that limited proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use. Commanders feared that if one was captured, the Germans might reverse engineer it. Yet the results at Monshaw were impossible to ignore. The German assault had been stopped cold, with casualties so severe they stunned both sides. News of the weapon's impact spread quickly to Supreme Headquarters. General Eisenhower, facing the desperate situation unfolding across the Ardennes, formally asked for authorization on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions were lifted. Proximity fuses were cleared for use in ground combat across the entire Battle of the Bulge. The speed at which they were distributed across the front showed one more American advantage: logistical superiority. Within days, proximity-fused shells were reaching artillery units across the Ardennes. At Bastogne, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion got their supply just as the German ring tightened around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, began firing them to defend the northwest approaches. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, used them with devastating results southwest of Bastogne. Every unit discovered the same truth: the proximity fuse transformed artillery. It was no longer just a support weapon, it became a battlefield game-changer. Forward observers didn't need perfect aim anymore. The fuses detonated at the right height on their own. Accuracy mattered less, while lethality skyrocketed. Bastogne, surrounded but superior. The siege of Bastogne became the ultimate test of the new weapon. The 101st Airborne Division, cut off and outnumbered, still held the vital crossroads against wave after wave of German attacks. Their survival depended on artillery support, including the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, armed with 75mm pack howitzers firing proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds, according to official records. Not all of them used proximity fuses, supplies were limited, but those that did were devastating. German assault formations collapsed under the airburst barrages, with entire platoons wiped out in seconds. December 22 ND, the German attack that followed General McAuliffe's famous nuts reply to their surrender demand showed just how effective the new weapon was. German infantry, moving across snow-covered fields in traditional formations, were caught completely exposed. The proximity-fused shells exploded overhead with deadly precision, creating overlapping patterns of steel that left no safe place to hide. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion played a crucial role in the defense. Their 155mm howitzers formed a ring of death around Bastogne that German forces could not break through. The larger shells detonated about 50 feet above the ground, spreading fragments over huge areas. German prisoners later admitted that entire units lost cohesion before even reaching American lines, men fleeing in terror from the incomprehensible rain of airbursts. The Sauer River slaughter. Perhaps the clearest example of proximity fuse power came at the Sauer River near Echternach on December 25th to 26th. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was racing north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed the fight and later described it in his memoir War as I Knew It. A German battalion tried to cross the half-frozen river, believing that darkness and fog would shield them from American eyes. With traditional artillery, U.S. gunners would have needed time to adjust their fire, giving the Germans a chance to finish crossing or find cover. But proximity-fused shells didn't need that. With proximity fuses, no adjustment was needed. Patton later wrote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new proximity ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run, the river behind them, our fire in front and overhead. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. That number, 702 killed by actual count, remains one of the few precisely documented casualty figures from proximity fuse use. The efficiency was chilling. In just minutes, an entire German battalion was wiped out, with no chance of escape and no defense possible. The psychological shock rippled through the sector. German soldiers began refusing orders to attempt further river crossings. Forest warfare transformed. The dense Ardennes woods, which German troops had always relied on for concealment, became death traps once proximity fuses arrived. In open ground, shells bursting 30 to 50 feet overhead were deadly enough. But in forests, the effect multiplied. Airbursts shredded tree branches, sending out thousands of wooden splinters as secondary projectiles. Some were as long as a man's arm and flew at hundreds of feet per second with lethal force. The old tactics, hiding behind thick trees, digging foxholes beneath roots, became useless. Death came from above, breaking centuries of hard-earned battlefield wisdom about fighting in forests. American artillery units quickly realized the multiplier effect of the new weapon. A single 155mm shell with a proximity fuse, bursting above the forest canopy, could wipe out everything in an area the size of a tennis court. The deadly mix of steel fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from shattered trees created a 360-degree kill zone that no tactics could escape. German troops trained in forest fighting found their skills suddenly worthless. Spreading out to reduce casualties left them exposed to the wide area bursts. Staying close together for support meant whole squads could be destroyed by a single shell. There was no right answer to this new threat. This was technical supremacy in action. To soldiers of the 1940s, the proximity fuse seemed like science fiction. Each fuse carried a tiny radio transmitter working at 180 to 220 megahertz, constantly sending out waves that bounced off anything nearby: trees, vehicles, the ground, even human bodies. As the shell approached its target, the reflected signal grew stronger. When it hit the exact intensity that matched the ideal burst height, an electronic switch triggered the explosion. And all of this had to work under conditions that would destroy normal electronics. When fired, the shell endured an acceleration of— the shells had to survive 20,000 times Earth's gravity, enough force to crush a human body to near microscopic thinness. They spun so fast that centrifugal forces were enormous. Temperatures ranged from 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit in the gun barrel to bone-freezing cold at the top of the flight. Yet those fragile vacuum tubes, cushioned by clever shock absorption systems, survived and worked with better than 80% reliability. Engineers found the best burst heights through heavy testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground. For the standard divisional 105mm howitzer, 30 feet was ideal. The bigger 155mm guns were deadliest at 50 feet. Rare 240mm shells blew up higher, 70 feet or more, and could clear whole grid squares of enemy troops. That edge in technology turned quickly into battlefield control. Studies showed proximity fuses made shells 5 to 10 times more lethal than ordinary rounds. The area covered by deadly fragments jumped by a factor of 50. In anti-aircraft roles, the improvement was even more striking. Shooting down V-1 flying bombs went from 17% to 79% success within weeks after the fuse was used. But German intelligence had a catastrophic blind spot. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammo depot and captured roughly 20,000 proximity-fused shells. That windfall should have let them develop countermeasures fast. Instead, German technicians who examined the captured fuses found themselves stuck. The devices were marvels of miniaturization and secrecy, assembled with parts and techniques they simply could not reproduce under wartime pressure. Documentation, manufacturing know-how, and critical components were missing or beyond their industrial reach. In short, the Germans couldn't quickly reverse engineer the secret. Their confusion, combined with American production and security, meant effective German countermeasures never arrived in time to blunt the fuse's impact. The result was clear: technical mastery, backed by massive industrial output and tight secrecy, reshaped both the physics of battle and the fate of engagements across the Ardennes. German engineers studied the captured shells and finally declared them impossible. The idea that fragile vacuum tubes could survive inside an artillery round went against everything they believed about electronics and ballistics. Many concluded the Americans must be using some kind of magnetic detection, or that the visible parts were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This failure came from institutional blindness. Before the war, Germany had actually been ahead in proximity fuse development. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940. But Hitler's order canceling any weapons project that needed more than 6 months to reach production killed the program. German engineers simply couldn't accept that the Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. The irony was bitter. German electrostatic proximity fuses, using electrical capacitance changes instead of radar, had reached 95% reliability in tests. If development had continued, Germany might have had working proximity fuses by 1941. Hermann Göring later admitted under interrogation that German fuses were only 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. The Christmas catastrophe. December 25, 1944 brought no holiday pause. German units trying to use Christmas Day to resupply and regroup learned the hard way that proximity fuses respected no ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and staging areas came under brutal bombardment that needed no forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired more than 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most with proximity fuses. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered fast, precise fire that smashed German units completely off guard. For the first time, artillery could strike effectively without observation, in bad weather, and even in the dark. Artillery had just evolved from a daylight weapon into a 24-hour threat. The psychological effect was crushing. German morale began to crack under the relentless rain of invisible death from above. German soldiers had learned to move in bad weather, when Allied planes couldn't fly and spotters couldn't see them. But proximity fuses destroyed that last refuge. Death could come at any time, in any weather, with no warning except the brief whistle of shells overhead. Malmedy and Skorzeny's elite. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny's hand-picked commandos tried to seize Malmedy. These weren't ordinary troops. They were the same men who had rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and slipped through American lines disguised in U.S. uniforms. They represented the very best Germany could send. But when they advanced, they met a storm of proximity-fused artillery fire. Their American disguises turned from clever camouflage into death shrouds. Shells burst overhead with uncanny accuracy, as if they could sense the impostors below. The exact casualties are still debated, but the outcome was clear. The attack collapsed in disaster. Skorzeny's offensive operations ended in failure. Even more striking was the psychological effect. These elite SS troops, raised on the idea of German superiority and drilled to the highest standards, found themselves utterly powerless against American technology. Reports say some survivors broke completely, charging straight at American lines, choosing quick death over waiting for the next barrage. It was a total collapse of discipline among Hitler's most fanatical soldiers. Industrial achievement. The production miracle behind the proximity fuse was as great as any wartime achievement. By December 1944, more than 100 American companies had switched over to fuse production. The Crosley Corporation stopped making refrigerators to assemble fuses. Emerson Radio turned from home electronics to weapons. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric devoted entire factories to the project. The quality control was stricter than anything mass production had ever seen. Each of the 130 parts was tested one by one. Every solder joint was checked under a magnifying glass. Random samples were actually fired to prove they could survive in real combat. The rejection rate was merciless. Any part with the slightest flaw was thrown out. The workforce was mostly women, working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Because of wartime secrecy, they didn't even know what they were building, only that it was critical to the war effort. By December 1944, American factories were turning out one proximity fuse every 2 seconds, day and night. The cost drop was just as dramatic. In 1942, each fuse cost $732, more than the average worker made in a year. By late 1944, mass production had slashed the price to just $18 per fuse, without sacrificing quality. That efficiency made possible the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 used in the Battle of the Bulge alone. Patton's arithmetic. General Patton probably understood the value of the proximity fuse better than any other commander. His Third Army, racing to relieve Bastogne, used them like a breakthrough weapon. His artillery chief, Brigadier General Edward Williams, even invented new tactics built around the fuse. Williams created the time-on-target attack, several artillery battalions firing, so their shells all landed at the same moment. When dozens of proximity-fused shells exploded at the perfect height at once, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death. Between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The result was decisive, German resistance broke, and the road to Bastogne opened. Patton himself later wrote, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." The Battle of Elsenborn Ridge proved the fuse at its absolute best. The U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held key ground against Hitler's 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, from December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, about 40,000 of them proximity-fused. Though they were only 25% of the shells, they caused an estimated 60% of the 5,000+ German casualties. The math didn't lie. Proximity fuses increased American firepower fourfold. German attacks up the steep, tree-covered slopes ran into walls of airburst steel. Whole companies vanished in seconds. Bodies piled so high that later attackers had to climb over their own dead. After 3 days, the assault stopped. The elite of the Waffen-SS had been shattered by American technology. Operation Bodenplatte, destruction. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, 900 fighters sweeping Allied airfields. The surprise was total. Many Allied planes sat helpless on the ground. But when German pilots returned, they faced a wall of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 were shot down by anti-aircraft guns, most thanks to proximity fuses. The kill rate stunned everyone. German pilots who'd been trained to dodge anti-aircraft fire found shells bursting exactly where they would do the most damage. The Luftwaffe, already weakened, never recovered from those losses. Breaking the secret. By early January 1945, secrecy was slipping. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers had seen what they did. On January 6, the War Department allowed limited disclosure. The New York Times reported a new kind of artillery shell that multiplied American guns' effectiveness, but didn't explain how it worked. German intelligence realized the truth too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Army West said, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." Strategic Impact Assessment. After the war, the true impact of proximity fuses became clear. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt admitted, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Otto Manschufel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, agreed. "American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops." The numbers confirmed it. 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired, causing an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, up to 20% of total German losses. These fuses made artillery 5 to 10 times more effective than normal shells, and they didn't even need forward observers in bad weather. The human cost. Behind every number was a tragedy. Many of the German dead were teenagers, conscripted in the war's final months, dying in ways no one had ever imagined, killed by shells that seemed intelligent, able to find them wherever they hid. But Americans paid a price too. The factory workers who built the fuses endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and accidents that were quietly covered up in the name of wartime secrecy. The workers' burden. At places like Crosley Corporation and Emerson Radio, workers pushed themselves to the limit. Many suffered exhaustion and breakdowns from endless hours on the line. They were building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, yet they weren't allowed to know what it was. They carried that burden in silence, bound by wartime secrecy. But war never allows for simple moral judgments. The Battle of the Bulge alone cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer would the war have dragged on? How many more victims would have perished in the Holocaust while battles delayed liberation? Every day the war ended sooner meant thousands of lives saved. The technological legacy. The proximity fuse didn't just change the war, it reshaped the future. The tiny vacuum tubes designed for the fuse laid the groundwork for modern electronics. The strict quality control systems developed for production became industry standards. The massive coordination of hundreds of suppliers pioneered what we now call supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen, who designed the fuse's miniature tubes, later applied his expertise to satellites, discovering Earth's radiation belts. The radar principles inside the fuse evolved into today's radar systems. Most importantly, the idea of a weapon that could sense its environment and decide when to act became the foundation for guided missiles, the beginning of the smart weapons that dominate warfare today. The reckoning. The Battle of the Bulge finally ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. But the revolution that began with the proximity fuse in the frozen forests of the Ardennes continues on battlefields to this day. The end of Hitler's gamble. Germany's last offensive cost them around 100,000 casualties and achieved nothing. The Americans lost 75,000 men, including 19,000 killed. In this brutal exchange, one thing became clear. The proximity fuse wasn't just another weapon. It was a war winner. General Eisenhower himself admitted that if the Germans had possessed proximity fuses, D-Day might have been impossible. That shows just how decisive this technology was. It wasn't merely an improvement to artillery. It rewrote the rules of war. For German soldiers, the experience was terrifying. They faced shells that felt almost intelligent, exploding at the perfect height, turning the very air into a killing zone. Foxholes, trees, ditches. No hiding place was safe. For them, this was the moment war changed forever, when technology itself became the deadliest weapon. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, to the systematic firing of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, the proximity fuse proved that science could decide battles. It was the product of American industry, scientific genius, and tactical daring, and it helped tip the war's outcome. But the story isn't only about machines. It's about transformation, technological, tactical, and human. The proximity fuse showed that a free, industrial democracy could produce weapons as powerful as any dictatorship. It proved that innovation could outweigh numbers, and that the side with superior science would often prevail. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare truly began. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets hidden inside artillery shells, changing not just the Battle of the Bulge, but the future of war itself. The German soldiers who died under those airbursts weren't just casualties of one battle. They were the first victims of a new era of war, an era that still shapes our world today.